So, I want to welcome you to the world of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian psychologist who believed in this thing called the unconscious. The unconscious is this area where we're not very aware of as human beings, but it dictates a lot of our behavior, our thoughts, and our drives. Now, what is in the unconscious? I mean, just imagine you've got an iceberg, and 90% of that iceberg is actually under the surface. Now, the conscious mind is that 10% that we actually know of and can see, we're aware of. Imagine there's 90% of you, though, under the water, and we can't see it. This unconscious, according to Sigmund Freud, is full of some urges, some drives that push your behavior, your thinking. And these drives are sexual. So basically, sex, anger, and death are the three things he talked about as being in this unconscious, and they drive a lot of our behavior. Sigmund Freud believed that we also have this, his theory of personality believed that we have this thing called the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, the id is what develops kind of first. The id is basically, you basically just put a K in front of it because it's like the kid. It's all of those impulses that we have. Those things that if you didn't have a filter, you'd probably be incarcerated if you just functioned according to the id. In fact, we get the word idiot from Sigmund Freud's word, the id. An idiot is someone who acts out on their impulses. I want what I want and I want it now, very much like a toddler. And so the id is the driving force in our personality. Now, there has to be a balance for that. So there's this thing called the superego. Now, the superego is this ethical, moral compass that we have. The superego kind of keeps the id in check. Now, somewhere in between there's this thing called the ego that develops. And the ego is the mediator in between the id and the superego. The superego, if we always followed it, we would always feel guilty and never take any risks. We would always let our morals and ethics basically dictate our behavior. The id, if we followed it, would be incarcerated. So the ego helps us have some of the impulses the id wants, but get them in a way that pleases the superego or doesn't cause conflict. So it's a mediator between the two. So for instance, let's say you've got a crush on someone. You can't just go up and put your tongue in their mouth, right? You can't just go up and start kissing on them. You've got to do it in a socially appropriate way. So instead, you ask them out on a date. You say, hey, can you help me with my algebra homework? I'll meet you at IHOP and we'll get some pancakes. Now, if you end up in a syrupy embrace later on with this person, it's all because the ego took what the id wanted, but with the rules of the superego, dating and courtship, then we got what we wanted. We still ended up in that syrupy, sticky embrace with pancake syrup all over our lips with the one that we love. And so it's kind of the one that balances and mediates what we want. So Freud's theories are very controversial. He came out in a time when you really didn't talk much about sexuality, and he definitely got on the map by very much talking about sex and, in fact, making it a big driving force of our lives. Now, you have to understand his now theory of what we call psychosexual development. He believed that we develop according to different erogenous zones of our body or areas of sexual stimulation. And we'll start with the first stage, the oral phase. The oral phase is about the first year of life. In the oral phase, we're obviously fixated on the mouth, right? And if you think about it, we manage our anxieties as kids as a mouth in our mouth. We put our hands in our mouth and suck on our thumb and have a pacifier. I mean, think about what you do with an anxious baby. You give them a pacifier and it calms their anxieties, right? Well, let's say something went wrong during one of those things during that first year of life. Maybe mommy and daddy didn't meet their needs. Or maybe mommy and daddy got into an argument and daddy left and didn't come back. Now, the baby loves daddy, but could the baby control that? Absolutely not. So baby develops these anxieties that later will result in these things called oral fixations. These oral fixations, nail biting, eating too much, maybe drinking or smoking is a really common oral fixation. And so we see that the child will develop these oral fixations later in life as a way to compensate for the anxieties they had when they were 0 to 1 in the oral phase. Now, the anal phase is the next stage. The anal phase from 1 to 3 is really all about control. Controlling, you guessed it, Uranus. And I don't mean the planet, I mean your physical anus. I mean the idea that we learn potty training and to control ourselves, and it kind of empowers us then to believe that we can control our lives and do that in a way where we can have some independence and function normally. Now, what if something happened in your environment that was then out of control from the time you were 1 to 3 or so? Well, then you would later develop all these compensatory behaviors. You're going to hear a theme with Freud. He's constantly talking about compensating for things that happened in our childhood. So these compensatory behaviors, you may use the word anal when you're talking to someone who's a control freak. You may say, man, you are so anal. You're just dropping some massive psychology on them, because what you're saying is basically, hey, when you were 1 to 3, you couldn't control your own poop. So now you're trying to control your poop and everybody else's. It's a really heavily psychological term. So when you call someone anal, just know you're dropping some serious Freud on them. So anyway, this person becomes a control freak later in life. You're going to see one of the foundational ideas of psychoanalytic thought, which is psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory, is what we call Freud's theories. They're rooted in the unconscious, and all these childhood experiences or previous levels or stages, he's a stage theorist, which means that certain things happen at certain ages, and if they don't, they can haunt us in later times of development. That if something happens in an earlier stage, it haunts us and it doesn't go away, but it keeps on coming back to us. That's a kind of a trademark of Freud's psychoanalytic theories. So we go from this anal stage then into the phallic stage. Now, the phallic stage is very much about the child kind of discovering their parts, right? And so kids from 3 to 6 are oftentimes pool sharks, and I mean pocket pool sharks. They've got their hands in their britches all the time, exploring themselves and finding themselves. In fact, my buddy called me on the phone one day, and he was laughing so hard because his son was in the bathtub and he had an erection. So his son has an erection in the bathtub and he's using Toy Story bath soap. His son was 3. He takes the lid off the Toy Story bath soap. It happens to be a little cowboy hat lid, and he puts it on the top of his erect penis and he says, "Look, Daddy, Woody." And my buddy was laughing so hard because he was like, that's Woody in so many ways. And so his buddy, his little son there had discovered that he's got this powerful thing called the penis. The phallic stage is all about discovering those areas and some arousal that happens in those areas. And no big deal if it all happens that you develop normally and you feel empowered during that time. But if you don't feel empowered, you could try to compensate by maybe later in life. For the child that feels like he's got a small penis, he tries to compensate later. And so he just kind of goes over masculine. He buys a big truck and he puts a lift kit on it. And he's got the dual exhaust and the bass thumping as he comes up beside you at the stoplight. The next time someone does that, I want you to roll your window down and simply put your pinky up and give them a wave out the window. It'll reach deep into their psyche and just crush them. And so there's 3 to 6. It's all about your parts and discovering them and discovering there's some power there. The little girl might discover that she's not validated in the home, according to Freud, and she might develop this thing called penis envy. Now, I do want you to be able to identify sexism when you hear it. Freud had this idea that penis envy then was a girl's desire to, if she wasn't validated, to take control of men because she didn't have a penis down the road. And so she's going to constantly try to control men. But understand what that did is it set up a situation then where a young lady who, when she's assertive, we see her as being over assertive. And the truth is, in men, we typically respect assertion and being assertive. It was kind of a sexist thing that Freud set up. He was actually a very sexist theory. You can look at a lot of his research. He studied men only for the most part. And so you can tell a lot of his research was very sexist. And so that penis envy was one of those. Karen Horney would eventually create a theory in response to Freud's theory called womb envy. And womb envy was all about this idea that men were afraid that women would figure out that they're the dominant of the species. And really, if you look at disease resistance, lifespans, things like that, women are the dominant of the species. And because of that, they would develop, men would develop this thing called womb envy, where we were jealous of women and the fact they could have babies, and so we tried to keep them under our thumbs. Now, sociologically, you're going to see in almost every culture in the world, men have tried to keep women under their thumbs, so maybe there's a little bit to that. Now, at the end of the day, there's not a single time that, as my wife was giving birth to our children, did I think to myself, man, I would love to be able to shove a bowling ball out of my hoo-ha. I didn't one time think that. In fact, I was grateful that God made me a man. I wasn't one of those men that said, oh, I'd love to take your place. I was one of those men that went to the hallway and said a little prayer to God and said, thank you, God, that I don't have to go through this. Otherwise, we probably would not have had children. But and I don't think my wife gets up in the morning and thinks to herself, man, I wish I had something dangling between my legs. However, sociologically, we know she would probably get paid more for the same job if she did. And we see that throughout, just labor statistics that you can look up. So sexism still exists, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with penis or womb envy, but they're both interesting concepts. Now, the phallic stage is usually from 6 to 12. The latent stage then becomes the next stage, and that goes on from 6 to 12. Okay. Now, the latent stage is the time when we're supposed to be a little disconnected from sexuality. Now, this is kind of an interesting turning point because from 3 to 6, you are very much fixated on opposite gender parent from 3 to 6. In fact, Freud would call it the Oedipal complex, that you would actually want to have sex with your opposite gender parent. So from 3 to 6, you're looking at mom, if you're a little girl, thinking, I'd like to kill you so I can have sex with dad. And vice versa, that little girl is looking, or little boy is looking at dad thinking, I'd like to kill you so I can have sex with mom. So that's Freud's idea from 3 to 6. 6 to 12, the latent phase, is a departure from that because now sexuality is supposed to be suppressed to some degree, and you're supposed to now figure out what people of your gender do in this world. It's one of these things called gender typing, and we figure out, we watch mommy, little girls watch mommy, and little boys watch daddy, and figure out this is how I'm a man in this culture, this is how I'm a woman in this culture. And so we typically hang out with same-sex peers. Not any kind of issue if your child doesn't, but for the most part, little boys hang out with little boys and little girls hang out with little girls, figuring out this is what my gender does in this culture. And so that's the phallic, that's the latent stage when it's all kind of underlying. Now, again, if sexuality was unearthed or uncovered or unwrapped during this time from 6 to 12, it could be pretty dangerous because the child's not ready to deal with sexual relationships. So something like sexual abuse or exposure to pornography can make them distort the gift of sexuality altogether if that happens during the latent phase from 6 to 12. Now, one of the thoughts of Freud is that development basically stops at 12. It's called the genital phase. And basically 12, you are healthy adult sexuality, and as long as nothing happened in those previous stages, everything should be healthy and good to go then. So the genital phase, you should be able to enjoy healthy sexuality and healthy life and all of those things. However, we know from his theory that if things happened before, it can cause you hurdles now in your adult life. And so with Freud, you can kind of see these patterns. I kind of wanted to tell you a little bit about Freud before we talk about someone named Erik Erikson. He also studied with Freud and took his theories in very different directions. And so tune into the videos on Erik Erikson.